March 8, 1932. 2:17 a.m. South Clark Street, Chicago, Illinois. The courtroom lights had been shut off hours earlier. The janitor locked the rear entrance. Snow pressed against the windows like ash. Frank Nitti had just been convicted. Across the river, in a furnished room rented under a false name, a federal witness packed a single suitcase. No farewell, no signature, no forwarding address. He had testified against the Chicago outfit. By dawn, he was gone. Not transferred, not assassinated in the street, not found in a ditch. Gone. The Bureau of Prohibition recorded him as relocated for security purposes. The newspapers printed nothing further. The trial transcripts were sealed. The Untouchables moved on to the next indictment. But within months, that same witness vanished from federal payroll records. His stipend stopped. His alias dissolved. His new address disappeared from internal correspondence. No obituary, no missing persons file, no body. The government had promised protection. Instead, silence replaced him. The Untouchables became legends for their victories over organized crime. But one name, the man who spoke under oath, was erased. And the question remained, was he eliminated by the outfit or absorbed by the system that needed him to disappear? Chicago in 1932 was not merely a city under prohibition. It was an economic ecosystem built on it. By the early 1920s, illicit alcohol had transformed neighborhood gangs into vertically integrated criminal enterprises. At the center stood Al Capone, who inherited a structure refined by violence and accounting discipline. Bootlegging routes ran through Cicero, South Side warehouses, and Lake Michigan shipping corridors. Distribution required protection. Protection required politicians. Politicians required payment. The Chicago outfit was not chaos, it was administration. Revenue from breweries and speakeasies was laundered through real estate, unions, and trucking fronts. The outfit's leadership operated through layers, insulated by buffers who absorbed risk. Street shooters were replaceable. Accountants were not. Nor were men who understood delivery schedules, bribe lists, and coded ledgers. Federal intervention intensified after public outrage over gangland killings. The Bureau of Prohibition was underfunded and politically pressured to produce results. In response, a small team of agents led by Eliot Ness targeted breweries rather than gunmen. The press branded them the Untouchables, emphasizing their refusal to accept bribes. But federal mythology concealed operational limits. There was no formal witness protection framework. Informants were handled through ad hoc arrangements, temporary stipends, assumed names, quiet relocation. The man who would later testify was not a capo. He was a logistics intermediary, positioned between warehouse managers and distribution captains. He handled invoices that did not exist on paper. He reconciled numbers that could not be audited publicly. His proximity to revenue streams made him valuable and exposed. He entered the outfit for stability. The Great Depression had constricted legitimate employment. The organization offered cash, predictability, and protection. Loyalty was transactional, not ideological. Federal leverage did not begin with patriotism. It began with arithmetic. Discrepancies in tax filings. A seized ledger. The threat of indictment not only for bootlegging, but for conspiracy and tax evasion, charges that carried federal prison terms far from Chicago's influence. He was not recruited because he was courageous. He was recruited because he was cornered. The Untouchables required testimony to legitimize their narrative of incorruptibility. The outfit required silence to preserve internal trust. Between those forces stood one man whose value ended the moment he spoke under oath. The Chicago outfit did not expand through impulse, it expanded through structure. At the top sat the boss. Below him, an underboss managing enforcement and revenue allocation. Beneath them, capo regimes controlled geographic sectors. Cicero, the South Side, near North. Soldiers executed directives. Associates handled transport, bookkeeping, union coordination. Violence maintained discipline. Accounting maintained power. During Prohibition, breweries were concealed behind legitimate storefronts. Alcohol moved at night in trucks registered to produce companies. Payments were divided with precision. A share for municipal officials, a share for police precinct intermediaries, a share for political ward leaders. The machine functioned because each participant benefited. After Al Capone was imprisoned for tax evasion in 1931, operational authority shifted to his successors. Public attention framed this as collapse. Internally, it was succession management. The hierarchy remained intact. The informant operated inside this infrastructure. He was not a trigger man. He was more dangerous than that. He reconciled distribution totals from breweries on 22nd Street with retail allocations in suburban territories. He verified weekly receipts. When shipments were hijacked or skimmed, discrepancies passed across his desk before they reached senior leadership. He saw patterns. He knew which precinct captain received envelopes on Thursdays. He knew which alderman intervened when trucks were impounded. He knew that federal raids often preceded internal tips, suggesting corruption beyond the outfit. Publicly, Chicago society treated bootlegging as tolerated vice. Speakeasies hosted businessmen and journalists. Privately, failure to remit revenue resulted in beatings or disappearance. The same system that produced champagne for elites produced fear in its middle ranks. Trust inside the outfit was conditional. Advancement required sponsorship. Sponsorship required proof of discretion. When a man vouched for another, he assumed liability for that man's silence. The informant understood this code. His vulnerability did not stem from ideology. It stemmed from arithmetic irregularities during the economic downturn. Revenue dipped. Internal suspicion intensified. Leadership began auditing operations more aggressively. Discrepancies placed him under scrutiny from two directions: the outfit questioning his competence, federal agents questioning his records. He was positioned at a fault line. Above him, men who could authorize murder. Below him, workers who could disappear. Outside him, federal agents constructing a public narrative of reform. His rise within the organization had granted him proximity to power. It had also eliminated any margin for error. The fracture began with numbers. In late 1931, federal agents executed coordinated seizures of brewery equipment tied to Chicago outfit fronts. Among the materials confiscated were partial ledgers, coded but decipherable when compared against municipal shipping permits. The discrepancies were not dramatic. They were incremental. But incremental errors accumulate into indictments. The informant was summoned twice in the same week, first by his capo regime, then on federal investigators. Inside the outfit meeting, the tone was restrained. Questions were framed as routine verification. Why had revenue from two South Side routes declined? Why were warehouse tallies inconsistent with retail collections? He answered cautiously. Weather disruptions, police interference, labor shortages. Inside the federal office, the tone was procedural. He was shown copies of tax filings, transportation manifests, A threat outlined in legal language: conspiracy, tax evasion, potential multi-year federal imprisonment. He understood the asymmetry. The outfit could discipline quietly. The federal government could prosecute publicly. But federal prosecutors required more than ledgers. They required testimony that translated arithmetic into narrative, proof that revenue moved upward through a defined hierarchy. The decision to cooperate was not immediate. It evolved over weeks of quiet pressure. Surveillance outside his apartment, subtle indications that internal suspicion was growing. A warning passed indirectly through a trusted associate. Leadership was reviewing financial officers. He calculated risk. Remain loyal and face possible internal retribution if blamed for losses. Refuse federal cooperation and face indictment with limited defense. Cooperate and hope federal protection outweighed retaliation. The Untouchables promised relocation, a stipend, an alias, assurance that the outfit's reach would be contained. But in 1932, there was no statutory witness protection system, no structured relocation protocol. Protection relied on discretion and budget. He chose to testify because it appeared to offer survival. He did not yet understand that testimony would solve the government's problem and create his own. The trial was not simply a prosecution, it was performance. By early 1932, federal authorities faced mounting criticism. Prohibition enforcement had consumed resources while organized crime adapted faster than legislation. Public confidence required visible victories. Convictions validated budgets. The Untouchables became a symbol: disciplined, incorruptible, efficient. Their reputation, amplified by newspapers, transformed enforcement into narrative. Each courtroom appearance was staged within that frame. But the testimony threatened more than the Chicago outfit. The informant statements connected bootlegging revenue to municipal complicity. He described weekly collections allocated to ward intermediaries. He detailed selective enforcement patterns, how certain shipments passed through checkpoints uninspected while others were seized. If pursued aggressively, his testimony could implicate elected officials. Federal prosecutors narrowed their scope. The indictment centered on financial crimes and conspiracy within the outfit hierarchy. Political entanglements were referenced obliquely, never fully developed. The objective was conviction, not systemic exposure. Inside Chicago's political structure, concern intensified. Not because of the mob alone, but because public trials risked destabilizing established arrangements. Law enforcement, political offices, and organized crime operated within overlapping spheres. Open confrontation threatened predictability. The informant, under oath, described internal accounting practices and revenue distribution up the chain of command. His testimony was measured, technical, credible. It supplied connective tissue between seized ledgers and leadership responsibility. The jury returned a guilty verdict against key figures, including Frank Nitti. Newspapers celebrated federal triumph. The Untouchables were framed as reformers dismantling criminal empires. But after the verdict, attention shifted. The press moved to the next headline. Federal agencies redirected resources. Political stakeholders recalibrated. The informant, however, remained an unresolved variable. His knowledge extended beyond the indictment's boundaries. He understood municipal payments, enforcement patterns, names omitted from transcripts. In open court, he had limited his testimony to what prosecutors required. Privately, he knew more. The government had extracted what it needed: a public victory. The outfit had absorbed a conviction but retained structural continuity. Political actors avoided exposure. Only one participant's position had fundamentally deteriorated. He had spoken, and in doing so, he no longer belonged to any system that could fully protect him. Protection in 1932 was improvised. There was no centralized relocation authority. No interagency protocol. The modern witness security program would not exist for decades. What federal agents offered instead was temporary anonymity, rented rooms, small stipends, instructions to remain inconspicuous. The informant was moved within Illinois first, then, briefly, to a neighboring state under an assumed name. His payments were processed through discretionary funds allocated to the Bureau of Prohibition. For several weeks, the arrangement held. He avoided public spaces. He did not write to family. Federal contact was limited to periodic visits from a case agent who delivered cash and reiterated procedural caution. There were no armed escorts, no secure facilities, only distance and obscurity. But distance is fragile when records remain. Chicago outfit networks extended beyond violence. They operated through union halls, freight lines, private investigators, and sympathetic officials. A man changing cities could still leave traces. Utility registrations, employment inquiries, forwarded correspondence. Simultaneously, federal priorities shifted. With convictions secured, budgets tightened. Supervisors questioned continued expenditure on a witness whose courtroom utility had ended. Internal memoranda emphasized fiscal efficiency. Protection was never codified. It was discretionary. The stipend decreased. Visits became irregular. Then came the final transfer, not to a new safe location, but to independent living under instruction to establish ordinary employment. The government would no longer provide direct oversight. He was advised to avoid Chicago permanently. He complied. Weeks passed without contact. In payroll records, his name, or rather, his alias, remained listed briefly. Then it disappeared from internal accounting logs. No formal termination entry, no confirmation of continued residence, no documented threat assessment. The arrangement dissolved quietly. Whether by administrative indifference or calculated withdrawal, the effect was the same. The protective barrier thinned. And in organized crime, thin barriers do not endure. No gunshots were reported. No body was recovered. The disappearance did not resemble a typical outfit reprisal. Chicago had witnessed public executions before: alleyway shootings, barbershop ambushes, cars riddled with bullets. Violence, when necessary, was demonstrative. This was different. The informant's final confirmed sighting occurred in late April 1932. A boarding house proprietor in central Illinois later told investigators that a tenant matching his alias vacated the room without notice. Rent had been paid through the week. Personal effects were minimal. There were two plausible mechanisms. The first, retaliation. The Chicago outfit possessed reach. After Frank Nitti's conviction, internal audits intensified. Leadership sought to identify the breach. Informal intelligence networks extended through rail employees, union contacts, and private investigators. If the informant's alias was compromised, retrieval would not require spectacle. A quiet extraction. Transport. Disposal in remote terrain or industrial sites along waterways where bodies were rarely recovered. The second, abandonment. Federal stipends had ceased. Oversight had ended. A man stripped of both criminal protection and government supervision occupied a precarious space. Without resources, he may have attempted contact with former associates. That alone would constitute a death sentence. Alternatively, he may have fled voluntarily, adopting yet another identity beyond federal knowledge. Archival correspondence offers no definitive conclusion. Internal memoranda contain brief references to discontinued relocation support. No follow-up investigations are recorded. If he was eliminated by the outfit, it was methodical. If he was abandoned by the government, the result was predictable. In both scenarios, the outcome converges. He ceased to exist in official documentation. The courtroom had amplified his voice. The systems he served then erased him. Frank Nitti's conviction did not dismantle the Chicago outfit. Within months, operational control stabilized. Leadership recalibrated revenue channels. Prohibition enforcement continued, but the structural relationship between organized crime and municipal influence persisted. One conviction altered headlines. It did not dismantle the machine. The Untouchables' reputation, however, expanded. Public memory preserved their integrity. Newspaper profiles emphasized discipline, incorruptibility, tactical precision. The disappearance of a cooperating witness did not fit that narrative. It was neither celebrated nor scrutinized. It simply went unmentioned. Internally, federal agencies absorbed a quiet lesson. Witnesses were essential for prosecuting hierarchical crime structures. Yet without formalized protection, cooperation produced unacceptable risk. Subsequent decades would see incremental reforms, culminating much later in structured relocation programs under the Department of Justice. But reform was reactive. In 1932, the absence of infrastructure meant survival depended on improvisation. Improvisation favors institutions, not individuals. No congressional inquiry examined the missing witness. No investigative series reopened the question. Archival silence replaced accountability, shifted to the Treasury, and later federal shifted to the Treasury, and later federal agencies. The Chicago outfit endured beyond prohibition. Federal mythology endured beyond the men who created it. Only the informant's trace vanished entirely. His testimony secured a conviction. His existence complicated the legend. And legends are rarely built on unresolved disappearances. March 8, 1932. A suitcase closed in a rented room. A man stepped into the snow believing testimony had purchased safety. The conviction entered federal records. The legend of the Untouchables hardened into history. Chicago continued negotiating power through quieter channels. The informant's name dissolved into administrative shorthand. Relocated, then nothing. Organized crime depends on hierarchy and silence. Government power depends on narrative and precedent. When those forces collide, the individual who bridges them becomes expendable. If the outfit eliminated him, it reaffirmed internal discipline. If the system abandoned him, it preserved institutional momentum. Either way, the mechanism protected itself. The Untouchables are remembered for what they achieved in court. The witness is forgotten for what he risked outside it. Snow falls without record. Files close without ceremony. And sometimes the most consequential disappearance is not the one found in a river, but the one removed from memory.